and then I look at the actual history of Christianity, this person, Jesus, the claims he made, you suddenly discover is some extraordinary evidence around his death and resurrection. And you start to put all the pieces of that puzzle together. And suddenly I find you've got a very interesting and quite strong case that Christianity makes sense of, but that it's much harder to make sense of on this naturalistic, atheistic account of the universe.
Well, welcome back to the Finding Something Real podcast, friend. This is your host, Janell Wood, and I'm here with Lizzie, who's been curating the content for this podcast over the last few weeks, actually the last couple of months, which has been pretty cool. It's been a little while. We actually have some more, is that the right word? Some more new episodes. I feel like that's the wrong adjective.
I think so is unnecessary. You can just say more new episodes.
We have more new, there we go. We have more, I only had 2.5 hours of sleep left.
So it's just redundant.
Yeah. We have more episodes that are coming your way, more new episodes, but I'm taking some time off in the month of July, enjoying some time with my family. Lizzie, you're taking some time off too, right? You get to enjoy some summer activities.
I have stuff here and there.
You have stuff here and there. So you and I are going to record a Patreon episode that's going to go out the end of June, and we'll also have one the end of July. And starting again in August, we're going to have some new content for you with Lizzie and I podcasting together. You don't want to miss that. We just had a really great recording with a couple people, and you definitely want to check those out. But for now, we're pulling old episodes out of the vault, things that have never seen the light of YouTube. I've been podcasting for almost 5 years. It'll be 5 years in September. And these are episodes I thought that maybe would be really cool for you, but also for whoever's listening, that you might find some value in this. So I hope that you enjoy this particular episode.
Yeah.
Okay. See you soon. Bye. Welcome back to the Finding Something Real podcast. This is your host, Janell Wood. And friend, I am so thankful that you're here today. Today is a very, very special episode. I am so excited that we've been talking about deep faith questions here on the podcast. And I have a very special guest today that I wouldn't have on the podcast were it not for today's special co-host. Today's co-host is the youngest co-host I've ever had on this program. He's my favorite 11-year-old. He's making a funny face right now, or he was. Today is his first day of middle school, and he was missing a class today just to be here. And I'm so glad that he wanted to be here and that he was so interested in having today's guest on the program. Please welcome Mr. Caleb Wood.
Hi.
Woohoo. Hi, Caleb.
Hi.
Hey, Caleb. Hi. Hey, if you hadn't pushed me, I don't think I would have ever invited today's guest on the program. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. You kept on asking me over and over again to invite today's guest on. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember a few months ago when I was putting you to bed one night and you looked at me and you said something about having hard questions about your faith?
Well, yeah.
Yeah. And at the time, I think it kind of bothered you that you had some questions. And then you and I started listening to a podcast. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And do you remember what podcast that was?
Yeah.
What podcast was it?
It was named Unbelievable.
Okay, you got to go a little bit closer to the microphone and enunciate like practice.
Okay. Unbelievable.
Unbelievable. And who is the host of the Unbelievable podcast, Caleb?
Justin Brierley.
Justin Brierley. And what does he do?
It's hard to say. He hosts two guys
Or girls.
But yeah, they have a discussion where like they try to explain their perspective of the world, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And there's different questions. I especially like the one where I'm pretty sure it's also named the Big Talk. It's where these two really smart guys do a discussion. And I think this might be on a different one of the podcasts, but I think it was on this one. And he was explaining how, like, the dice roll, every time you roll, like, if you roll a 6, that's 1 out of 6 already. If you roll a 6 again, that's 1 out of 12. Then you roll again. I think that might be a 1 out of 18 or 1 out of 24. Depends on what you multiply it. But every time it gets harder and harder.
Yeah. And was that an example of the chances of the universe actually forming all by itself? Kind of seems like that was one of the... Yeah. So, Caleb, why did you want to invite Justin Brierley on this podcast so badly?
Because I had some questions that I wanted to ask him, I think.
Yeah.
I don't really know. I just wanted him on here.
Yeah. Well, I want to introduce today's podcast guest, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more about the reasons why here in a second. But today's guest is Mr. Justin Brierley. Justin is the former editor of Premier Magazine, the leading Christian magazine in the UK, United Kingdom. He's also a devoted husband, father of 4, an Oxford graduate, highly sought-after speaker, an accomplished author. But the truth is, he's probably best known for being the host of a radio/podcast program called Unbelievable for over, I believe it's 13 years. Is that right?
Over 15 years, believe it or not.
Over 15 years?
Well, it will be 15 years this October, believe it or not.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. All right. Over 15 years.
I think you said 50 for a minute.
Not quite that long.
It's not that old. Justin has been inviting Christian and non-Christian guests on his program to engage in conversations around, as he puts it in his book, Ideas and Objections Leveled at the Christian Faith. He shared in his first book back in 2017 that as the host of that program, the listenership had grown to over 2.5 million downloads per year. I'm guessing that number may have grown since then.
Yeah. We're very fortunate. I think it's around 4 million downloads a year now that we see on the podcast, which is great. But that's I should say that's kind of across the whole back catalogue. So it's not like there's 4 million listeners every week or anything. But
wow,
it's great. Yeah, and a lot of them in your neck of the woods in the USA, North America. So
yeah. There's nothing like it. A quick Google search reveals that this program has hosted some of the most well-known Christian and atheist thinkers in the world. Names that you would probably be familiar with, Richard Dawkins, NT Wright. I'm trying to think, John Lennox. There's quite a few people. And it's remarkable, really, what you've done, Justin. So I'm delighted you're here. Welcome to the program. Well,
it's a real delight and an honor to be with you, Janell and Caleb. And thank you, Caleb, for being the instigator of all of this.
Welcome.
I'm really honored, and I'm really encouraged actually that the program is speaking to people of so many different ages, because that for me is hugely encouraging. And I'm guessing you're a very smart young man, Caleb, just because. Anyone who listens to Unbelievable is smart anyway. But you obviously you're someone who enjoys those big questions that we cover on the show. So yeah, it's great. And, yeah.
Justin, how old are your kids? You have 4 as well.
Yes. So my oldest was about a year old when we started the show. So he's going to be turning 16 in November. And then we have a 12-year-old. Grace. So our oldest is Noah. He's our 15-year-old. Grace is 12. Jeremy is 9. And Toby is our youngest. He's 5.
Okay. So. Do any of your kids listen to your program?
Probably only if it happens to be on in the car or something. They don't. Not many of them purposefully choose to listen to it. I'm afraid they're probably not as discerning as Caleb when it comes to their listening choices. But No, they do. They do. I mean, little bits and pieces, and we quite often, if it has kind of been on in the background or they've heard something, it'll spark a conversation and that kind of thing. So,
yeah. I think your program has been a gift to my son. I mean, I can't speak for you, Caleb, but as your mom, I just want, and I'm going to take off my podcast host and just say this as a mom. As a mom, it's been a gift for my son to be able to recognize that asking tough faith questions is okay, and that you can be a believer and still ask hard questions and wrestle with them. So your program has ministered to him, and I'm very grateful as a mother, not just as a host.
That's fantastic. Well, as I say, I'm very honoured, delighted that Caleb is a listener, and hope that that continues well into the future.
Yeah, me too. All right, Caleb, you've got the first question there.
So, how did you become a Christian?
Great question. So I grew up in a Christian family, but of course, growing up in a Christian family doesn't make you a Christian. And I really had to find my faith for myself. And that kind of came really in my teenage years. I'd say up to the age of about 14 or 15, I was kind of going to church because my parents went to church. And I enjoyed it, and I had some friends in the youth group. But I wouldn't say it was something that was like really alive for me in my life. So it was really kind of at about the age of 15 that I started to take things more seriously, started to, people were asking, hey, were you thinking of getting baptized at some point, Justin? And it was a kind of one of those moments where I was thinking, well, what do I believe? Is this my faith, or is this just something I've kind of inherited from my parents? And it was actually, particularly for me, there was one weekend when I went away on a youth kind of camp retreat. And I'd been helping to play guitar in our kind of youth group worship band and that kind of thing. And I just had a very powerful experience when my youth leader prayed for me this one evening, where I just felt the presence of God in a way that I'd never felt before. And it impacted me very deeply that night. And suddenly it was like the world turned kind of technicolor, if you know what I mean. It was like a penny dropped in my mind. It was like suddenly something was there that hadn't been there before. And I just had this passion that wasn't there before for God, for Jesus, for the Bible, for exploring this faith and for living it. And that was kind of, so for me, there was this very specific one night I remember where suddenly things came into focus. And I would say that was where my relationship with God really began in a significant way. That's not to say that, there haven't been many more points along the way that have been significant. And my faith today is, has evolved in different ways, has changed, in kind of terms of my appreciation of many things. But I'd say that was the kind of the starting point. That was where things really kicked off for me. And I suddenly felt different. And I think people around me noticed it as well. I think my friends, when I went back to school, were like, whoa, what happened to Justin? He's suddenly talking about God all the time. And that kind of thing. But I always want to say, when I tell this kind of a story, which is a very kind of like dramatic moment kind of conversion, that's not the way it happens for everyone. My wife, Lucy, very, very different. She would say that she's always just sensed that God's there, and she's just kind of gradually grown into a kind of relationship with God. She didn't have any one moment where suddenly it all happened for her. But the point is, we've both arrived at the same destination, and however you get there, it doesn't really matter, actually. The point is you're both arrived at the point where you're trusting in Jesus Christ, and whether that's a one-time moment where suddenly everything changes, or it's just a gradual development over time. The important thing is that you get there. And so for me, that's important to recognize. Everyone has a different story in that way, but that's mine. It was quite a sort of dramatic thing at that moment.
Mm. You talk in your book about being very fond of having conversations with people. And you have a background in communications, I believe, drama and different things like that. Were conversations always an important part of your faith, or is that something that's matured as you've gotten older?
I think yes. I always wanted to, kind of like Caleb, I was interested, I think, from an early stage in the big questions. I wasn't that satisfied with simply being told, well, you just have to believe it because, the Bible says it or something like that. I wanted to know why the Bible says it, and I wanted to know why Christians believe what they believe. And I think it was particularly probably actually not long after I became a Christian, because that was during kind of my A-level years, which is sort of, I don't know what that is in US terms, but before I went to university, essentially. But when I went to university, I was started to kind of be surrounded by a lot more people with skeptical attitudes towards faith and Christianity. Not that I hadn't bumped into those before, because hardly any of my friends at school were Christians, but nonetheless, it took on a slightly new level when you get to university. And I think that was the point of where I really started to engage more in conversations about faith with people who didn't share my faith, and sensed the need to have more of an understanding of what the intellectual arguments are for Christianity. Because I'd had an amazing experience that was very personal to me,
Mm-hmm.
but it was hard for me to explain that to other people. If you haven't had that experience, then you're not necessarily going to experience the same beliefs. But I began to see that there are interesting ways of looking at Christianity, where actually there are things we can look at in history, in science, in philosophy, that do give us clues to the fact that there's a God out there and that this story of Christianity is true. And so that was really at university that journey began. But it was really through starting the radio show, the podcast, that it took on the life it has now of really seeking out those conversations on a weekly basis. And that's been very exciting to be able to host that kind of a conversation so frequently.
So tell us a little bit more about that podcast and radio program, because not everybody would do what you've done, which is to engage these conversations, not just with people who share the same opinion as you, but especially with people who are brilliant thinkers who think completely opposite of what you do, which some people would say that's quite risky. So tell us how Unbelievable came about.
Yeah, well, it is risky. And I'll be honest, when we first started putting the show out, not everyone was a fan. You have lots of Christian radio stations in the USA. Really, our Christian radio station in the UK was the first and only Christian radio station in the UK. So there was a lot of sense of, like, for some people, when I started bringing non-Christians and atheists and agnostics, people of other faiths on air to talk about their beliefs, a lot of our Christian listeners said, hang on, we want Christians on our Christian radio station, not atheists. Right. We've got plenty of them on the BBC. So what? And that was a challenge. But the reason I wanted to start doing that was because I felt like, well, look, most Christians in the UK, especially, they can't live in a bubble. They're going to have non-Christian co-workers, friends, family, school members, whatever around them. And it's good to encourage Christians with Christian music and teaching and that community on air. But we also need to recognize that most of us don't live in that bubble, and give people the tools to have conversations and understand people where they are. And so that was really the purpose of Unbelievable, was to help Christians listening to it on a Christian radio station to hear alternative points of view and hear a Christian responding to that and having hopefully a civil, fruitful conversation, and learn how they could go and have a similar kind of conversation in the process. But like you say, it's not a safe thing. It's a bit of a risk. And, we got some complaints, but
which, in their defense, right? I just want to pause real quick. Yeah. I was reading in your book, and as of the writing of this, which I think was in 2017, is that right?
That's right.
5% of people in the UK go to church on Sunday. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. About
very
that.
Smaller percentage, a lot more post-Christian thought across the ocean there. Yeah. So a lot of people feeling inward, like, let's protect this. And you're saying, let's have these conversations.
Absolutely. Because I think it's precisely because we are in a small minority, in a sense, Christians and churchgoers, certainly in the UK, is precisely why we need to be more equipped to have conversations, because you can't live in a bubble. Now, maybe up to a point when we're young, and as I had, a kind of Christian community around me through my church and so on. But once kids are released, into the university setting, and we don't really have, as you have in the US, Christian universities. There are no Christian universities, or they're a tiny, tiny minority. So you're in a secular environment as soon as you leave, secondary school education. And I think we need to do a better job of preparing our young people for that. And very often, I'd rather they ran into the arguments against Christianity in an environment where they will at least hear a decent response, than to simply run into one and not hear or not know of a response. So even though it's tough, and maybe the natural reaction is to sort of go into bubble mode, I think we need to be a bit braver than that and step out and hear what the counter points are. Because in the end, what I've experienced is I've been sat through plenty of shows where I've been made to feel very uncomfortable, because I'm thinking, wow, this guy's got some good points. I don't know what my Christian guest is going to say now, but I'm feeling a little bit like, but actually over time, I think you learn actually how to respond, what the responses are. You learn not to be afraid. You learn actually to be able to listen and not immediately sort of get sweaty and think, oh, this person. You learn a much, I think, more healthy way of interacting and responding, which kind of is about really gaining confidence. But most of us gain confidence by falling off the bike a few times before we can keep riding it. There's going to be uncomfortable moments, and that's just natural. But it's worth it in the end. The pain is worth it in the end, if you like.
Yeah. Well, and your audience grew. It didn't just stay with those Christians in the UK. It grew to people who don't necessarily believe. I was just reading some reviews of your book on Amazon, and quite a few of them were from people who don't believe, but still love your program. And it's interesting, when Caleb and I first started listening to your program, Justin, I didn't know that you were a believer. And you kind of mentioned that in your book, that sometimes people say that, but the couple of episodes we watched, it wasn't real clear to me, because you're so, how would I say it? You're so careful to give both sides a chance to speak, and to not put your own agenda in there, which I would think as a Christian. I mean, I'm a podcast host, and sometimes I have people with different views on here too. And that's hard not to share your opinion. So do you ever feel like you're in your head praying and asking God, please give wisdom to whoever's speaking right now? Like, is that something you do, or just in the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm honest, there are times when I'm thinking, I have all kinds of different people on every week. And there are some times when I thought of the Christian guest, I wish they would say this right now. I wish they would take that line, because that's the way I would do it. But I'm there, as you said, to be essentially a neutral moderator in those conversations. Just give each side the opportunity, hopefully steer the conversation in directions that are fruitful, move us on if we reach an impasse, that kind of thing. And I think that's important, because, as you said, it's a mixed audience, very mixed audience who listen to our podcast. It's Christians and non-Christians. And I want both sides to feel like they're being given a fair hearing. So you will hear me, sometimes if I feel the atheist is getting the better, maybe come in with a question or a suggestion on the Christian side. But equally, if I feel the atheist is kind of, on their heels, then maybe I'll come in, on their side a bit and put some questions to the Christian. So I'm there to hopefully try and kind of create some sort of a balance to the conversation. But having said all that, there are actually, if you listen through the entire archive, you'll find plenty of moments when my Christian colours clearly shine in some form or another, where I'm asking a question, specifically speaking as a Christian. And indeed, on the podcast especially, maybe not, you don't see this so much on the video side, but on the podcast side, when I'm responding to some of the feedback that comes in and that kind of thing, I'll inevitably be responding with a Christian perspective, because I am a Christian. But yeah, certainly for the interview section, for the dialogue section, I've always tried as best I can to be neutral And I think that's been quite helpful in creating what one of my listeners calls a demilitarized zone for Christians and non-Christians to come together. It helps if you can make both sides feel welcome in that way.
Yeah. Caleb, I'm sorry. I think I stole one of your questions. Do you have one to follow up to? It was the one that I think you have next, but you could ask anything. You don't have to go in order like that. Based on what he said, do you want to ask anything?
Like what, where was it really hard for you to understand the Spirit and to believe?
When was it hard to believe?
Yeah.
Yeah. When did I run into kind of doubts about Christianity and that kind of thing?
Mm-hmm.
Well, as I say, at university really was when that started to hit home. And I went through, quite a significant period of doubt actually at university when I'd been really challenged by a friend who didn't believe. And it made me ask, well, am I just believing this because I had some crazy experience, when I was 15 years old? Is this all just in my imagination, was my question. And I think it's important to ask that question. Okay. And what I started to do at that point was I started to read some really great Christian thinkers, people like C.S. Lewis, for instance, who has been I've been a lifelong fan anyway of C.S. Lewis. So I kind of grew up reading the Narnia stories, but really in my late teens, I discovered C.S. Lewis also had this extraordinary gift of what we call Christian apologetics, the defense of the Christian faith. And he's got many books that you can read where he gives reasons why Christianity makes sense. And I read him and started to read others as well. And I was also blessed to actually be at Oxford University. There's a very strong Christian union there. So student Christian union where they had great speakers and often addressed the kinds of subjects, around difficult questions around Christianity and so on. So that was a great help. But it was so that period of doubt kind of came and then went again. And sometimes I find that things, it kind of washes up and then recedes again. And it's difficult to say exactly what happened, but I think there was just a sense that actually the doubts receded a bit, and I felt like I had more confidence because I felt I had some answers to them. I think, though, it wasn't really until I started The Unbelievable Show that I really started to put the pieces together in a more kind of systematic way. Because what that gave me the opportunity to do was to just hear every week from Christians and non-Christians and all these different arguments. And I just started to see the themes that would emerge. And and this was kind of where the book came from, really. I started to realize, that's an argument for God that's really interesting. And I think that's quite a powerful one. And that one I'm not so convinced by. But this issue over here, that's a really tough question for Christians. But here's an answer to that. And as I started to sort through that in my brain, I started to come up with a kind of, I suppose, what I would call my own kind of way of thinking about the evidence for God and for Christianity. And that was where it began for me. And this doesn't mean that it proves it's true. I think a really significant moment in my brain was realizing you're never going to prove that Christianity is true, intellectually speaking. And I don't think actually anyone gets argued into the kingdom of God in that way. There's always going to be a mixture of the head and the heart whenever anyone comes to faith and comes to Jesus. But I do think there is good evidence for Christianity. So even though you can't prove it, you can actually show that it makes sense. Okay. And what I realized is that we've all got what you could call a worldview. Now, if you don't believe in God, if you think of yourself as an atheist, some atheists say, well, I don't have to prove any, I just don't believe. So, all of the burden of proof is on you as a Christian who's making all these claims about God and Christianity. But actually, in my experience, if you're an atheist, you do believe some things, okay? Because most atheists I meet subscribe to something, and it gets a bit technical now, but something called naturalism, which is the idea that all that exists is nature, is matter, particles, electrons. physical stuff, basically. That's all that exists. Now, if that's what you believe, you've got to show me why that's true. Okay. It's not just my job to show you why I believe there's a God and why I believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God and died and rose again. Those are the kind of my beliefs as a Christian. But if you're a naturalist atheist, you also have a whole set of beliefs. And the problem is many atheists I meet haven't really thought about that fact. They haven't thought about the fact that, well, I believe certain things, and how do I know that's true? So we've both got a way of looking at the world, if you like, and both of us have to decide which one is true. And what I found is that rather than trying to say, I'm going to prove God, the best thing in my conversations with my non-Christian and atheist friends is to say, let's look at both our pictures of reality and let's look at which seems to best fit the evidence. Okay. Now, and that's where I begin saying, well, let's look at the universe. Science tells us it came into existence, this Big Bang moment, this extraordinary event that science has shown happened 14 billion years ago. Now, does that fit best with this idea that all that exists is nature, matter in motion? Or does it fit best with the idea that there's a creator God behind the universe? And for me, I have to say, I find the Christian explanation works better there, because the problem is, if everything came into existence, including matter, 14 billion years ago, well, then where did the matter come from? It's what you say, all that exists. Well, actually, at some point it didn't exist. Feels like you're missing a step. There's something wrong with that picture of reality. There's something beyond matter that has to be there for anything to begin, for anything to get started. And equally, you mentioned the dice video I've done. There's this extraordinary phenomena, again, in science called the fine-tuning of the universe for life, where various physical constants and specific things about our universe, the ratio of electrons to protons in the universe, the force of gravity, the electromagnetism, all kinds of things had to be at a take a very, very, very specific value in order for chemistry to happen at some point in the universe and for life to exist. And it's, again, is it just pure chance? It feels like it seems like the only explanation on a naturalist point of view is that it was a chance event, our universe happening to come into existence in a way that could produce life. But given the odds against that, and I use this dice analogy to explain why it would be like rolling 76s in a row, which is like an unimaginably large number of odds to get just the right force of gravity, for instance, for things not to explode out into the universe or collapse back in on themselves. Chance doesn't make sense, but that's what the naturalist atheist kind of has to go to. Seems to make a lot more sense to say someone intended us to be here because the numbers just stack up that way. And that's just a couple of a number of different arguments that you could point to where you build a case for saying, okay, which version of reality makes best sense of the data? And there's a stuff out there in science. There's also stuff inside me that I have to explain. Why do I believe human lives matter if we are just actually bags of chemicals when we boil it down? All of that stuff. And then I look at the actual history of Christianity, this person, Jesus, the claims he made. What you suddenly discover is some extraordinary evidence around his death and resurrection. And you start to put all the pieces of that puzzle together. And suddenly I find you've got a very interesting and quite strong case that Christianity makes sense of, but that it's much harder to make sense of on this naturalistic, atheistic account of the universe. So for me, it's about what best explains the evidence. And that doesn't mean that you're going to be forced to believe it, but it's certainly going to become an intellectually plausible option for me. That's enough. It just makes it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled Christian. And when someone says you just believe in fairy tales, you say, well, no, I don't. I think this makes sense. So that is a really long answer to your short question, and I apologize because I've basically just compressed my book into that answer.
Well,
but, yeah,
it's great. I'm sure I know the answer perhaps to this, but I want to ask you anyway. Do you have people who contact you and say, because of your program, I'm now a believer? Or do you have people who, opposite of that, write to you and say, because of your program now, I don't believe and you've given me a way out?
Well, whichever way it goes, it's very rarely just because of my program.
Yeah.
There's people are complex characters, and my program may be one facet in lots of life experiences and conversations and everything else that's going on for people. So, but certainly, yes, it's always very encouraging when I am a Christian. I want people to believe in Jesus. When I get emails or people say your program either helped me to overcome doubts or helped me to become a Christian or whatever it may be, or, I went away from faith and I came back to it and your program helped, always very encouraging. Now, you're quite right, Janell. The traffic doesn't only flow in one direction. And I have a lot of non-Christians and atheists who listen and say, I've listened to so many of your shows, Justin, but nothing's ever convinced me to change my mind. And that's fine. I'm not assuming that everyone's going to change their mind. Equally, there are some people who are kind of engaged with the show and they might be on a trajectory that's kind of out, kind of moving away from faith. And I have had emails from people who have said, I'm sorry, Justin, but I've kind of actually moved away from faith. And maybe they felt more, the arguments on the other side were more compelling. And that's the risk, I'm not running a show where you only hear one side of the argument. It's kind of real life in that way. And of course, but I don't feel, I could beat myself up every time I get an email like that. Like, oh man, why isn't everyone getting converted or going in the right direction with my show? But I just kind of have to accept it. That I think it's worth the risk. That God actually is doing stuff even in the lives of people for whom they say, no, I've given it up or whatever. And it kind of just that's the realness of human life. People come to faith and lose faith, and that is the reality. You can't sugarcoat it. So I'm happy to exist in that kind of messy middle where people are coming and going, and just trust that God's working in the midst of it all. And I'm just trying to do the best I can in representing both sides fairly and see what happens,
Yeah. Well, I love what you're doing. And I wish I could say that I've thought about doing something very similar. I have a real heart for some young atheists / agnostics who have either lived in our home or who I've helped coordinate them staying in the U.S. And getting them to listen to this program is hard because it is one-sided, and yet there's that part of me that I'm just like, oh, do I open up that conversation more? I've had an atheist co-host at one point with Brandon Cleaver. That was interesting. But later she just said to me, I'm not coming on again. And so I know that people listen to your program from both sides. Why do you think they keep coming back and listening to you?
Yeah. And don't get me wrong. I think there is obviously a place for shows like yours where it's predominantly a Christian perspective. And I listen to loads of sermons, because I just want to be encouraged and built up in my faith. I love listening to, Tim Keller sermons and other stuff. I listen to plenty of other interview shows, which are just Christians. I run one, the Ask NT Wright Anything podcast is another podcast I run. And we're very specifically dealing with things just at a Christian level there, because I think there's a really important place for just building Christians up in their faith and encouraging and learning and teaching. But Unbelievable occupies a kind of a unique territory where we do that kind of, and I think it's because it's somewhat unique in the podcasting world. Though having said that, I see lots of great other types of shows increasingly popping up, especially on YouTube of a similar nature now. But I think the reason it has become popular is partly because there has been a thirst among a certain part of the population to hear these kinds of conversations. And among the Christians who listen, I think they're the kinds of Christians who want to grapple with this stuff. People like Caleb who want to, who maybe just feel like, I feel like I'm only getting one side of the story when I go to church or when I, listen to this podcast or whatever. And I think, and it's people who want to be challenged in that way and want to kind of, and that's a helpful thing ultimately for them to do. I think a lot of the non-Christians, atheists and agnostics who listen, you might wonder why would an atheist, listen religiously to a Christian podcast? I am a Christian. It is from a Christian media company. And I think the part of the reason is, there's lots of atheists and agnostics out there who want to understand why Christians believe what they believe. Mm-hmm. They might have believing spouses or in a community where that exists. I think there's a lot of people who've come out of a Christian background who can't quite leave it behind and feel like they need to kind of understand or want to question. They're not willing to just completely drop it. They kind of want some kind of engagement and to understand things. I think there's a lot of people who just enjoy a good debate on these issues. They like the philosophical kind of argumentation and that kind of thing. There's some people who I think are, quite on the sort of hard atheist edge who like see religion as a poisonous thing, and they're there to root for the atheists because they want to see Christians, whatever. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons, but overall, I'd say most people who come to the show, whether they're Christian or atheist, are coming for the same reason, which is they enjoy hearing intelligent people just have interesting conversations. And a lot of the sort of conversations we have, are on the most fundamental kind of questions, about purpose and philosophy and science and everything else. And I think that there's a lot of people who see that the universe is remarkable and are willing, and and even though they don't believe in God necessarily, they're kind of open to the idea that if someone could persuade, if there was the evidence there, I'd want to know about it. Mm. So I'm going to come back and hear what William Lane Craig has to say, or whoever it might be, and see. That I think is why the audience come back.
Yeah, I love it. I want to segue to some different people that you mentioned in your book. One of them, Caleb, why don't you ask the first question there? I just sent it to you in the chat. Do you want to ask him that first one about somebody he mentioned? He mentioned it just now here on our podcast.
Why do you love C.S. Lewis?
Why do I love C.S. Lewis? Well, I think partly because I did grow up having the Narnia stories read to me, so they kind of were very significant in my childhood. Or listening to them on tape in car journeys, that was another way. And before I even really knew much about C.S. Lewis, I loved the stories he told. But then I had the opportunity actually, when I was probably not much older than you are, Caleb, to actually perform in a play about C.S. Lewis. So there's it was subsequently turned into a film as well called Shadowlands. But C.S. Lewis was this Oxford Don professor of medieval literature, English literature, but who had this amazing ability to also write children's literature and wonderful Christian apologetics books. But he met and eventually married a woman, an American called Joy Davidman, and the story of the play and the film is about the fact that she contracted cancer, and the sort of intellectual and spiritual journey C.S. Lewis had to go on in confronting that. And I played in this play his stepson, Douglas Gresham. And so I got to sort of see C.S. Lewis's life through this particular stage play. And that I think was quite significant in kind of opening up the person to me at quite a young age, this person of C.S. Lewis. And then I went on, as I say, started to read in my teens and later teens some of his books like Mere Christianity and Miracles and the Screwtape Letters and so on. And I just really enjoyed the way he put things. I think he was a masterful storyteller, but he was also very, very good at the use of analogy. That's the idea of explaining something by likening it to something else. So he would say, that I believe in Christianity in the same way I believe in the sun, not just because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And that for me there's an amazing way in which he had a way with words where he could make a concept suddenly come alive with the way he had this amazing imagination to be able to make intellectual concepts not dry and dusty and stay on the page, but kind of come alive. And so I think all of that, made me, from a fairly early age, a big fan of C.S. Lewis. Yeah.
Somebody else that I wanted to ask you about, Bart Ehrman, famous New Testament scholar, former Christian. You've had quite a few former Christians on your podcast program. As a believer, are you sitting there thinking, man, just believe? I mean, is there a part of you that just feels desperate, especially as it pertains to people who formerly called themselves Christians? Because I mean, in Scripture, it talks a lot about it's impossible once you've known to fall away. How do you deal with that on a personal level? Because if I were having those conversations with somebody, I think I would feel burdened, like there would be a burden for that.
And it's not that there isn't. I mean, yeah. I think it's, in a way, it's much easier. I find the cases of someone who was a very committed Christian and then lost their faith, I find that much harder to deal with than someone who's just an out-and-out atheist and has never believed. Because it is harder, I think, for the Christian to understand someone who genuinely tasted, or appears to have, had that faith that you and I share, and yet has now managed to say, no, I don't believe it was ever really true. That's really hard, to take, and in a way is a much greater challenge to my faith than a Richard Dawkins who just says, well, I never believed it anyway.
Exactly.
So when I encounter that, I can only say that person has had their experience, and I'm not here to judge whether they really were or weren't a Christian. I think a lot of Christians, sadly, do immediately sort of say that, because I think it's a slightly defensive thing of saying, well, they can't really have been a proper Christian because, X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I find that, look, I'm happy to take someone at their word if they really did feel like, they were a Christian and so on. God knows the state of everyone's heart much better than we know, and I'm happy to leave that to God. The kind of the judging of the heart is not something I'm in any way qualified to do. So I just take their story as they say it and just engage with it. And I'm just happy to say, well, you've had a very different experience to me. And when we get to the specific issues of, say, a Bart Ehrman, what was it that eventually tipped him over the line into agnosticism, where he currently sits? If you go down and get into the long grass of that and ask the questions, you'll probably find out, oh, well, Bart just had a really different way of thinking about this issue than I have. That issue there's never really been an issue for me. I don't see why that I would have had a different reaction in his shoes to that. And that's, and a lot of this is because we're just different people. There's just, we are going to react differently to different situations. We've all got different life experiences. It's not that I've got some great piece of evidence that Bart Ehrman just hasn't heard about yet. It's just that for some reason, the evidence hits me in a different way to the way it hits him. The experiences I've had are different to his experiences, whatever it is. And you just have to accept that, I think. What we can do, we can still, debate the issues. I've frequently had Bart on opposite a believing New Testament scholar where, Bart thinks, his way and the New Testament scholar thinks the other way. And inevitably, the way they're approaching the text is going to be colored by their experiences. But I still think you can have a good debate on whether the Bible makes sense and whether, and frankly, what was interesting to me, especially, the first time I had Bart on, he'd written this very popular book sort of critiquing the reliability of the Gospels, essentially, do we really have the original words of the New Testament, and so on. And when I first read it, I was quite struck by it, thinking, gosh, that he's making some really good arguments here. It was one of those uncomfortable moments we were talking about earlier. But what I quickly realized once I had him on with the other guest, Peter J. Williams, and they've met again since, actually, quite recently on our Big Conversation series, I quickly realized there are always two sides to every story. And a lot of the things that Barth was painting as real problems for Christianity, well, if you just look at them in a slightly different way, they turn out to be strengths, actually, for the Bible. One classic example is Barth makes a big thing in his book about how many variants there are between different manuscripts of the New Testament over time. And, he says there are more variants between the manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. And fine, there are. But when you look at it with a slightly different perspective, you realize that's not necessarily a bad thing, because one of the reasons there's so many variants is there are so many manuscripts. And unlike any other ancient text of its time, we have loads of copies of the Bible, of the New Testament documents, over a wide span of time. So just the fact you've got so many means there are going to be variations when people made little mistakes. You also get the fact that vast majority of these variations make no difference whatsoever to the actual meaning of the text. And thirdly, you find that actually it's the fact that we've got variations that means the people who do the work of working out the originals can get back to the originals much better than they could without all the variations. It's actually a strength. It helps them to work out what the original said, because we don't have any of the original documents of the New Testament. We don't have any of the original documents of any ancient work of literature, because they were all written on papyrus that inevitably faded away and rotted. So what we have inevitably are copies of copies of copies. But we have copies that are very close to the original copies compared to most other ancient manuscripts. And we've got lots of them. And there's a very specific art of textual criticism whereby when you've got all these copies, you can actually work out by looking at the differences between them what the original is most likely to have said, and work out with a sort of 99.5% accuracy. So when I kind of got my head around that, I realized there's always two ways you can spin a story. And actually what at first sight seems like, oh, lots of differences between all these gospel, manuscripts. Suddenly you realize when you actually look into it, that's actually quite, surprisingly that's lends a lot of credibility to the documents. So it's things like that. That's one specific example. And that's one example where there's a very clear kind of difference. Yeah. But I so often it's about getting to grips with things, sometimes changing your perspective. There's lots of things where I've had to give up something that maybe I thought was the way things were supposed to be, and realize the Bible's more nuanced than that. It's not as simple as that. There's and that again is part of the story. As I said, my faith isn't the same as it was when I became a 15-year-old convert, but I would say I've got more confidence than along the way in the core, if you like, truths of Christianity as well.
Yeah. I want to ask you a couple more questions, but I have one more person I wanted to ask you about. And I know it's getting late. You've been so gracious. And the reason, of course, is, Caleb was the big reason why I eventually reached out to you, even though you're a busy person. And I said, hey, would you ever be interested in coming on here? But the other reason I reached out to you is because a couple of years ago, a friend of mine who's very much, I would say, very similar to me. We're both feeling type of people. When you're talking about all these different logic and arguments and different things, and I've had people on here who are apologists and who have all these reasons, which are fantastic reasons. And sometimes I'll pull something like what Caleb said, about, and what you shared about the dice. I'll think, man, like logically, this makes sense, But for most of my life, I'm a feeler. It's experience, like what you're sharing. And I've found that as I want to share my faith, part of the reason I have people come on this podcast who think differently than me is because it's a great way to share faith. But the experience is very personal. And I've had these amazing spiritual experiences that there's no other explanation for, in addition to, the logical things that I can also share with people. But a couple of years ago, a friend of mine said something along the lines of, I watched this thing on Netflix and it was this illusionist, and he was talking and he recreated this whole spiritual experience. And then he pulled the wool over their eyes, and he basically faked a faith experience, faked a healing experience for people, and made a claim as a former Christian that, hey, look, this is all fake, right? And I faked you. And that so disturbed me. And if I'm honest, Justin, I think part of the reason why I don't do what you do, which I find so fascinating and honor it so much, I think what you're doing is fantastic. I think part of the reason I don't is because of how much of a feeler I am. And if any person has come on your program who has challenged, who I think would challenge my own faith, it's a person who says that thing, it's all psychological. Now, I have a master's degree in psychology, right? So I can understand the psychology behind stuff. But you have nothing but grace and kindness when you speak of the very famous illusionist, Darren Brown. You've met with him. He's been on your program, I think, a couple of times. How do you reconcile what I imagine is, I mean, this is what I feel when I think of him. I think I'm sad for him, but then at the same time, I'm almost angry or discouraged by what he's doing for other believers, which is saying, this is all fake. And I know you've been to one of his shows, so would you share how you deal with that? Because I'd love to know.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I went to see the show that you're probably referencing. That the Netflix version is kind of the it's the same stage show essentially. It was called Miracle. What Darren Brown says that he was doing in that is essentially, he was very clear in the interview I had with him afterwards. He said, I'm not here to pull down people's beliefs, genuine faith, and so on. He said, I'm here to kind of expose the hucksters and the charlatans and the people who use faith, use religion to kind of make money, basically. And in a way, I'm all for that. If there are people out there who are genuinely kind of pulling the wool over people's eyes and doing fake miracles and, just using it as a way to make money, then I'm all for Darren Brown exposing them, because that's wrong. But at the same time, I left that show having a very similar feeling to you, which is, whoa, if Darren Brown can inspire all of these feelings that we so often, would assume are kind of God feelings when we're having a moment, in a church service, or we've had, some experience, charismatic experience or whatever, or believe that, we've seen healings, or we know people who've had healings and so on. And yet Darren Brown seems to be able to replicate that on stage. It left me feeling like, whoa, what's going on here? And again, it's an uncomfortable moment, and but it's a moment we kind of need to face. And firstly, we need to face the fact that I think Darren Brown's doing something important, which is saying not everything you feel is necessarily, verifiable. It could be produced by your emotions, by heightened sort of adrenaline and that kind of thing. Fine, that is true, and I think we need to be honest with that, and we need to actually be careful. I think it's a really good warning to Christians to say, let's not rely too much on the smoke machine and the ooey music to kind of get people in the right mood. How much are we relying on that stuff sometimes in our worship services, when we should be simply saying, if God's here, and we're gonna, okay. So partly it's that, but there's also the part of me which is, actually, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater either, because we are emotional people. That's the way we experience things. And there's no reason God would not choose. If God exists, it's perfectly understandable if God chooses to work through our emotions as well. So let's not assume that, every emotion therefore can simply be put down to pheromones and chemicals and that kind of thing. Because, as I say, you've got, for me, the best thing is to have the balance. It's not to believe in God purely on an emotion experience, nor do I want people to believe God purely on an intellectual experience, because both are sides of a coin. And when you bring them together, that's when I think you have something which is really good and fruitful. It's when you've got intellectual reasons for believing, but you also, you've got something which you can actually makes a difference in your life. That isn't just an abstract intellectual argument, but where you believe that you're sensing God, you're feeling God. There's someone, and for me, it's just about walking that line. And to some extent, it was really interesting because I know people who have been healed who would say they had a miraculous healing. There have been many, go and read the 2-volume book Miracles by, I'm trying to remember who it's by now. It's gone out of my head, but
C.S. Lewis. Did he write that?
No. He wrote a book called Miracles, but there's actually
Eric Bataxis?
No, well, he wrote another good book on miracles, but the one I'm thinking of, it'll come back to me in a moment. I've got it on the bookshelf somewhere here. Anyway, but it was just a huge sort of very well documented 2 massive volume academic study on, the documentation of miracles around the world. And I just, when I look at something like that, it simply beggars belief that every single one of them is done by some kind of emotional manipulation or whatever. You can get those results by emotional manipulation. I'm sure absolutely you can. Derren Brown is a very good illusionist. And I think what's also really important to understand whenever you're looking at something Derren Brown's doing, what he's doing on stage isn't always what he says he's doing. Okay. That I spoke to a couple of other magicians who met Derren Brown around the same time as I did that interview with him. And they said, yeah, I know he says it's mind control, but there's a lot of illusion going on as well. And I think it's important to just take it all with a pinch of salt anyway. When Derren Brown says, I can just reproduce these same things. Well, you can if you've got a dark stage and a lot of things going on that we can't see, Derren, yes. But that's actually not what most Christians in a normal environment where they're praying for each other have going on, actually. And also just the fact that if everybody who claimed healing actually hadn't been healed and turned out their leg was bad again the following day because the adrenaline had worn off, then maybe there'd be something in it. But the fact is we've got lots of cases of people who have had permanent cases of healing, and you can't then just dismiss those as, I just had an adrenaline rush for one night. And interestingly, when I spoke to Derren, he himself said the bizarre thing is some of these people who I've had, do my version of healing on, they've had permanent results. And he said, and I don't understand why that is, because it should just fade off. We are a complex mixture of psychological, emotional, intellectual creatures.
Yeah.
And the fact that Derren Brown can do stuff like that in the end, it didn't really bother me. It just made me realize, yeah, we're human. We're kind of, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't, for one thing, it simply doesn't do anything to the actual intellectual arguments for God that exist. It may cause us to be wary of simply going with every emotional experience, and especially wary of when those things can be manufactured. But it certainly doesn't in any way explain the vast majority of experiences I have had where I would say there's a genuine something God thing is happening. And so I'd say that's the thing, that I would hold on to is to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it's interesting to me because Derren Brown, especially in the second conversation I had with him, which was a little bit of a remove from that, I had him in conversation with an Anglican priest, and Derren Brown didn't come across as a Richard Dawkins style atheist at all.
I watched part of that interview.
He was very cognizant of the fact that we all need a story to live in, and that it's really important psychologically for us to have that. And I think he recognized that for a lot of people, Christianity has been an amazing way of making sense of the world and society. And I don't think he actually particularly wants to rip that away from people, even if he doesn't believe it himself anymore. And actually, I think he has a deep respect for people who have a very thoroughgoing faith. In fact, as he told me on that program and in private, one of his best friends is a lifelong Christian who he has the utmost respect for, even though he doesn't believe what he believes. And so I think, so it's important to say what you see on stage isn't always what you think you're seeing on stage as well. That's that I'd say is pretty important.
Yeah. Well, I have one final question. How can people find you online, Justin?
Okay. Very easy. If you literally just Google Justin Brierley Unbelievable, I'm sure it'll come up with the web address. But our show page at our website is premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. Or you can search up Unbelievable on YouTube and you'll get lots of our videos there. And again, search Unbelievable on, or Justin Brierley Unbelievable on Facebook, Twitter. You should find me too. So
yeah, well, I've loved the ones that I've listened to, but I think my favorite so far has been the one with Elisa Childers and Lisa Gungor. I thought that was fantastic. It was really good.
Really interesting show, that one.
Yeah. All right. This is the Finding Something Real podcast, and I always ask this question at the end. The Finding Something Real podcast is about a journey towards restoration or redemption, eternity, authenticity, and love. Those are all 4. It's actually 5, but I couldn't narrow down the R. It's an acronym for real. And it's things that we can find in relationship with Jesus Christ: restoration or redemption, eternity, authenticity, and love. Which of those things stands out to you the most in your life right now, and why?
Wow. Probably, the redemption side, because, we're living in a crazy time right now, aren't we? And it's a time when we're sort of having to really dig deep, if we're Christians, asking what's God doing? Where's the world going? What are we supposed to be doing in the midst of all this? And how can we make a difference? And I do believe God is a God who is telling a big story through the whole of his creation, through the whole of history. And we're living in one little bit of it. It's a very interesting, scary moment that we're living in. But I do believe God has purposes and plans, and that ultimately that is a redemption plan. Mm-hmm. And that everything we're going through now will make sense one day. There's going to be a reason. There's going to be a way in which we can be part of this story of redemption. And so for me, the challenge for me is finding the ways to be God's redemptive person, a person who models what Jesus did and said in this particular moment that we're living through. Because it's so easy to get caught up with the fear or the culture war or the kind of
the fire down the street.
Yeah. We're all going to hell in a handbasket and whatever it is, and think the only way out of this is politics. The only way out of this is or healthcare. The only way out of this, and there's nothing wrong with all those things. But the problem is actually none of them are enough, and they always let us down.
Yeah.
And we, for me, we've got to get on our knees and we've got to ask Jesus to, through his Holy Spirit, move powerfully through us, through others in this world, and see his redemption happen. And that, I don't know what the time frame is for that, but that's where we have to trust and just be faithful Christians, continuing to do what we do, to be his hands and feet, salt and light in the world. So for me, it's being part of that redemptive story, even when we don't know what the next steps look like, is what kind of that's the one that's been going around in my mind recently.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, thank you so much to Justin Brierley for being on the podcast today. I know it's late there in the UK, and I just really appreciate you taking the time. And Caleb, thank you for co-hosting with me.
You're welcome.
Great to meet you both. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, we appreciate it. And until next time,